Welcome to our pod, and by that I mean on Wednesdays we read. I'm Hannah.
I'm Laura.
And we are usually two best friends who do a deep dive into a new book series, one book at a time. But today is a bonus episode, and we
We're
are
three
welcome
best friends.
and we are welcoming to the podcast Moses Ose Utomi. He is an author of the YA fantasy book Daughters of Oduma and the fantasy novella trilogy, the Forever Desert series, which is on our top of the year already.
Like absolute all-time favorite books for me. I can't recommend them enough. People, go get them.
So Moses, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's nice to be here. It's nice to finally connect. I've been looking forward to this
Yes.
conversation for a while, so it's going to be fun.
Great. Well, we hope we live up to it.
I've been ranting about your books for months now, so I'm glad that we were finally able to get you here.
Moses was nice enough to come on after we did a hard sell on Twitter. I believe Laura was like, could you tag him in the post to see if he would be interested in coming on for an interview? So we did a hard sell.
Cover these books.
So can you tell us a little bit about your books and just a little bit of your journey as a writer?
Yeah. So, I mean, my journey as a writer, I'll start there. It's pretty typical, I think. I've just been a writing book nerd my whole life. I think I wrote my first book when I was like 5. My mom has a copy of it somewhere. It's bad, but it's good for 5, bad for after that. And then, I read a lot as a kid. I read a lot of fantasy. I ended up getting my MFA in creative writing. So that was actually the first like dedicated creative writing I did. I did journalism before that and songwriting, all this other stuff. But that was my first like fiction writing situation. So then after that, I kept writing. I wrote The Lies of the Ajungo, and I reached out to an editor who I'd met some years before at a party, Carl Engel Laird at Tor, and he liked it. And yada, 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 bada bing, bada boom, here we are. And Lies takes place in a world where there are multi-generational droughts. So there's been no water, no rain or anything for hundreds of years. And a long time ago, the Oba, or king of this place, the city, went to another empire and said, you guys have water. We need water. What can we give you in exchange? And they said, give us the tongues of all your citizens, kind of a steep price. And so the choice was either death by dehydration or this. And so they decided to take the deal. So everyone 13 years or older is what's considered a citizen. They cut out their tongues. They ship it to this other empire called the Ajungo. The Ajungo, however, are scumbags. And so instead of giving them enough water to really change their lives, they give them just enough water to barely survive. So it's become a ritual for the last several hundred years where every time anyone turns 13, their tongues are cut out, shipped to this other empire in exchange for a ration of water. And the story is about this boy named Tutu, who is about to turn 13 and lose his tongue when his mother passes out from dehydration. And he thinks, I can either lose my tongue and get her a little bit of water and then be back in the situation maybe a couple months from now, or I can go beyond the city walls into this endless desert full of magic and monsters and find water, not just for my mom, but for the entire city. And that's book 1. And that's the story of book 1. And while Tutu is out in the desert, he learns a lot about the world. He uncovers a lot of mysteries and learns a lot of kind of harsh truths. And book 2 picks up 500 years later about a boy named Osi, who is in the same place, but 500 years from now. It has a very different structure. Times have changed. And Osi essentially is a cop, this town guard, and he kind of has dreams of glory. And he wants to join this elite kind of special fighting force. And when his city is attacked by this ancient kind of mysterious enemy called the Aleke, he steps up and defends it. And for his valor, he's kind of rewarded with joining this force and tasked with this incredible mission of going across this forever desert, finding the Aleke, and kind of ending him once and for all.
It is. It's a
They're
masterful.
phenomenal.
Yeah.
Like these were books that were just like so beautiful and shocking, like and haunting too. Just your writing is phenomenal. So listeners, if you want, and they're quick reads too. Like the second you start reading them, you can't put them down. So I don't think that Moses's description did them justice, honestly, because they're so hauntingly beautiful and really just stick with you.
They're amazing. And Laura's right, they are novellas, so they're very short reads. You can get through them really quickly, but they're so deep and they have so many different layers. Your website mentions that your writing grows out of West African culture and mythology. Can you tell us about some of like these mythological inspirations in the Forever Desert series?
Yeah, so a lot of that is, I'm Nigerian American. I was born in America. My family's from Nigeria. a lot of the first stories I encountered were my dad telling me stories. My dad's a big time storyteller. He's obsessed with these things. He's always telling stories. And so a lot of the books are kind of channeling his voice and his um, some of the memories he talked about, even like memories he talked about. He went to college in kind of central northern Nigeria, so that's a more desert climate. Some of the things he encountered there. I grew up in the desert in Las Vegas, so I bring elements of that, but it's not like a clear this mythological creature shows up in the books. It's more of like over time his sense of that world and my interpretations of some of his stories and some of the different aspects of Nigerian culture I've encountered and some little bits I've researched are just kind of infused in a way to affect the voice and the feeling of the story.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna sound really creepy here, but I started following you on social media because I wanted to see if maybe you were dropping Easter eggs about the third book after I read the
Oh,
second one because I
okay,
was
I
like
should.
really obsessed with these books. And I noticed that you were using hashtags that were mentioning Attack on Titan. And
Mm,
I also really like that anime series. And I was kind of noticing, I'm like, your writing has a lot of these same like big action moments, the twists and the gut punches that are really similar to Attack on Titan. So I was wondering, do you consider anime to be like an influence on your works?
heavy influence. Yeah. I think there's like a whole generation of Black men in America that are obsessed with anime. I guess I'm part of that generation. I think some of it is like it was kind of the first other stories we got access to. You know, when you grow up in a
Mhm.
culture and you know you're not part of that dominant culture, and so the dominant media doesn't quite ring the same, and then you encounter something that's also not part of that dominant culture. And it's not necessarily your culture, but you're like, oh, we're both outside this thing. And I think a lot of it heavily imprinted onto me. Final Fantasy VII was like the greatest game I've ever played. It's heavily, everything I write is somewhat inspired by that. Attack on Titan. I grew up on Dragon Ball Z, and Yu Yu Hakusho, and Death Note, and Full Metal Alchemist is I think the best thing ever made. So um, elements of it, yeah, and kind of the rhythm of it, I think shows up in my writing a lot.
Yeah,
Laura
for
has been
sure.
doing a deep dive into anime and manga this year.
Oh,
So she
really?
like,
I I've
yeah.
been I've been watching a lot of Attack on Titan, so
It's the
when I
best. I
saw those
could
hashtags, I'm like,
We could do a whole podcast about Attack on Titan. I do think it's like one of my favorite stories in any media.
hmm
Yeah, it's yeah, like you said, a lot of the way it handles plot twists and a lot of the way it handles its themes and it's I think it's willingness to examine hero and villain mythology is stuff that really resonates with me. Yeah.
absolutely. And the idea of like what's a monster and who is a
Mm-hmm.
hero, yeah, for sure.
That
Yeah.
definitely comes through in your writing. Uh, the these two books are really well paced. They're novellas, but they don't really sacrifice anything for world building. Like just have like so many deep layers and textures and good like plotting in their 100 pages. Why did you choose novellas as like the best way to share the Forever Desert series? And were there any difficulties that came from writing in these shorter spouts?
I think of novellas as so when telling a story or trying to convey meaning, I think there's a spectrum, right? You can write a poem, which is probably the shortest possible way to do it, right? A poem could be 2 lines, 3 lines, and you're conveying an image or a feeling or an emotion, and then you can write the Wheel of Time or Song of Ice and Fire, a 12,000 page tome divided into whatever, and that's another way of conveying. And I think on the short end, you just get kind of an emotion or a feeling out of a poem. And on the long end, you get this incredible roller coaster of ups and downs and twists and turns and characters and characters and characters. And I think of a novella as kind of right in between to where I'm not going to give you a full roller coaster. I'm not going to give you just an emotion. And I try to conceptualize it as like if a epic series is a roller coaster, a novel is a roller coaster, a novella is just the drop. It's just the drop part of the roller coaster. And so you're just getting that emotional gut punch. And so when I knew with each of these books, I wanted to deliver a different emotional resonance at the end, it felt appropriate to do it in a novella because I think a novella it's like a good joke. You have the setup, then you have the punchline. If the setup starts going too long, things start to get lost. You need more things. You can't just have a 25-minute setup to a joke. And so I was like, well, novella is great. I can set up the emotion I want and I can deliver it at the end. If it starts to get longer than that, then I need to do something different.
I think that also makes
I
sense with
think
like
if you get too long, you become like book 10 of Wheel of Time, where it's like,
Right.
why are we reading this?
Right, yeah.
Why parents
Do we
searches
care
for
about this?
Fael.
Yeah.
Do we care about this anymore?
But I think that makes sense with also how you said the like stories were inspired by your dad's storytelling. Like a
Mhm.
novella feels like it is that kind of storytelling, and it's
Yeah.
communicated well where you have that good, setup and resolution. So it comes through.
Thanks. Yeah.
Something I noticed is that the acknowledgments of your book really neatly kind of wrap up the stories themselves. And in the acknowledgments of the for the lives of the Ajungo, you mentioned being an outsider and living within two realities. And so perspective is played with a lot in this series, and I really love how the perspective changes for characters and readers within the novellas, and how being an outsider can provide this deeper insight. I was wondering if you could tell us more about developing the perspective of an outsider as a character.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think some of it comes inherent to me. Part of my upbringing, part of who I am, part of the way I interact with my society around me. And so I think there's an understanding that comes from that so much of what we consider true or accurate or fair is just an issue of perspective. I studied psych in undergrad, psychology, and there's kind of an understanding psychology that modern psychology that most people are the result of their environment more so than hard genetic encoding. You can do a lot to change who a person is by changing their environment, changing what happens to them. And I think that's easy to forget when we meet other people, especially people who annoy us. We're like, that person sucks, instead of like, that person has lived through circumstances that make them suck, And
Yeah.
so
Mm-hmm.
I think in my writing, I'm really interested in creating characters who only know what they know and have only experienced what they've experienced. And I hope I convey that well to where, especially as the series goes on, as the reader, you start to have more information about the world than the characters do. And you start to sometimes see where their blind spots are. Especially, I think, by the second book, when we're talking about the character of Ose, you often know much more than he does. But that can't be helped. And I think if I do it right, it's not frustrating in the sense of like, get smarter, kid. It's like, it's frustrating in the sense of like, I see how one would have to operate given the information they have. And so the attempt throughout the series is to give the reader both put the reader in situations where they have no perspective, and then put the reader in situations where they do have perspective, and then they start to realize and empathize with the characters in a way that perhaps is harder to do when you're just watching the hero's journey and you never really see the villain or understand where they're coming from.
I love that.
You do this in such an effective way, because I read these books back to back in preparation for this interview. And I remember being like so jarred when I got to the second book and you
Yeah.
open it up and it tells you this tale and you're like, wait, what just happened?
Yeah.
And you realize it's so far in the future, and that like history has been shifted and moved from what you already knew about it. And I thought it was very effectively done. So
Yeah.
it did come through. Um, a lot of these books, a lot that happens in this book, there are truly like horrific moments that occur in this series, bodily sacrifice, things like that, at the hands of oppressors. And the series always seems to have that undercurrent, like you play well with the tension of knowing that there's something under the surface. But when we find out what happened, I found I was always surprised by it. What was your process for like writing these deeper storylines and having that kind of tension versus like shock value?
Yeah. I think tension is the most beautiful thing in the world, especially, I mean, narratively, tension in life is stressful, but like, when
I
it
was gonna
comes
say
to a
my life
story.
is ruined from it.
Right, yeah. Yeah. No, I don't like tension on the day to day, but like in storytelling, I think tension is the lifeblood of a story. Really. I don't enjoy being in stories where I don't feel any tension, unless it's for a short period of time to set up something bigger. But like the story of just generally minimal tension, I can't get into it. I think most readers can't. I think romance is big for a reason. Romantic tension is a real thing. People love it. And so in my stories, I want there to be tension as early as possible. And in book 2, that's part of the intent of that narrative about the previous narrative, is that there's an immediate tension. There's an immediate like, how am I supposed to process this? And how am I supposed to receive the information I'm being given?
Mhm.
Um, And so I try to, again, it's a novella. If it was a novel, I'd have to have more spaces for the reader to breathe. I could not sustain that level of tension for 400 pages. That would be crazy. But for a novella, I think for the most part, I can keep it going up until the drop. And that's part of why I love the novella as a form. Um, and so part of it was to imbue that tension early and keep it sustained. And I do think it helps kind of I think it helps the reader empathize with the characters when there's more tension, when they're making decisions that maybe aren't optimal, or they're afraid, or they're stressed. I I don't like it when I'm in a book and I'm being told the characters are feeling a way that I can't relate to. Like ideally, I should completely understand why they're feeling that way, and even more ideally, I should be feeling it as well. And so that's part of what the tension I think does.
Well, it's definitely there. And I think it is, like you said, a very tangible thing that we can, as readers, even if we aren't able to necessarily like put ourselves one to one in a situation that's been that stressful, we can very much feel like, uh-oh, this does not feel right.
Yeah, yeah.
So in the first book, Tutu's quest is primarily motivated by this dream to save his mother who is dying from dehydration or blood drought. And we also learned that Tutu's mother instilled in him like the importance of dreams. So I was wondering why you chose to portray a dreamer and how Tutu's dream to save his mother prepared him to confront the reality of his situation.
Oh, that's a good question. I haven't been asked that before. I got to think on that for a sec. I mean, so to to some extent, minimal extent, the characters are created in conversation with each other. Tutu, Ose, and the characters you're going to meet in the third book. So some of it is Tutu is the most idealistic. He's also the youngest, so it kind of fits, right? His sense of the world. He's the least traveled. He's literally never left his neighborhood. His sense of the world is very small, and so the only way he can interact with the outside world in any way is dreaming. In the book, he has the dream about a lion. He's never seen a lion. He lives in a city that lions probably couldn't survive in the city. There's no water. So um, that's his only way he has is idealizing the world and imagining the world. And so he's much more in his imagination in some ways than the other characters. Um, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, that does. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, and during Tutu's journey, he has these moments where like his world is getting expanded. He has to face realities, but he also has like a lot of idealistic moments where, he believes that you can't make friends beyond the city of lies, but then he encounters this trio of women who he does befriend. And why was it kind of important to you in this first book to show this kind of natural bond and natural friendship?
Yeah, part of it part of it was to we can talk spoilers, yeah.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah. Part of it was to show the unraveling of what Tutu'd been taught, right? These kind of three adages, and to show, if one of them isn't that true, how do we feel about the others? What does that mean for the others? Um, Part of it is that Tutu as a character was kind of organic to him. He's not naturally a suspicious, unkind person. He's naturally actually very sweet and very meek. And so there's this tension between who he is and who he's trying to be because of what he's been taught. And so to me, it was inevitable that he'd make friends because he's a friendly kid. He's curious and he's kind. And what's not, especially from older people, what's not to like about this, kind of cute little kid. And so some of it was like a natural resolution of who he is. And I think when he forms the friendships, and he realizes they're actual friendships, that I can trust these people in a genuine way. It's him growing up and realizing that, yeah, I can exist in a way beyond what I've been taught, from childhood.
Yeah, it's this ability to like make his own decisions and kind of form his own opinions. And I love that. There's also like this really unique magic system that is called seeing. I was wondering if you could explain to listeners how seeing is kind of tied to the power of the truth.
Yeah. Scene gets explored a lot more in book 3. I'll tell you that because I know you're excited about book 3. Yeah, book 3
Yes.
really does dive into the magic system. So I'll try not to. My brain is like fragmented between all the books right now, so I'll try to like stick to what's
If you
in book
want to
one.
just read the third one to us right now, that's
Sure,
fine.
sure, yeah.
We have all afternoon. It's fine.
Yeah. So the way scene basically works is that in the first book, they require these artifacts called God's eyes, which are just kind of randomly strewn around the world, little black beads that kind of give them access to the power of the goddess they worship. And through a combination of knowledge and conviction, it's kind of a summoning of what you know and a reinforcing it with what you believe. They're able to interact with the energies of the world. And the most common way is to absorb energy and release energy. So in the first book, we see Tutu in some fight scenes where we see other characters in fight scenes too, where somebody hits them, they absorb the energy of that blow, and then they are able to, fire it back in a different form. However, so one thing I like to do with magic is I think it's important that magic isn't science. I think a lot of magic systems are basically science, which is like, just make it science. And so one thing I enjoy in my books is having magic be really magic. And it's a bit unpredictable. There's not always a strict line between cause and effect. And it's also not fully understood. I don't know how, when I see these magic systems where like they know all the rules, I'm just like, how do they figure that out? Like how, like we don't even know all the rules of our current world. There's diseases we can't solve. There's things we can't build, and so it's like they just, by the time they're in the whatever equivalent of the Middle Ages, the 1300s, they figured out all the rules of this magic. And so in this world, they don't know all the rules. They're able to use it. We have buildings. That doesn't mean we understand physics perfectly. And so they're able to use it. They're able to get often the desired effect. But because they believe it relies on what you know, it brings in the question of truth. Like, do you have to know something truthful? What if you know that the sky is green? Is that knowledge? Is that, and how does that affect one's use of this magic? So the second book gets a little more into that, about to what extent is your knowledge true, and to what extent can your conviction overcome a lack of knowledge.
That's something I definitely noticed in the books, was this like difference between, you talk a lot about how in the second book with sight, what's really important is having like an education on things and looking for the truth and having this like questioning of yourself, and how that can sometimes be in tension with power, and how power is this motivation that is almost like it is lonely, and it is selfish, and it only wants to become more and become more and more and more. So can you tell us a little bit more about developing like these themes of like knowledge versus education and truth versus power?
Yeah. Oh, this is fun. We can talk spoilers, right? So, yeah. When you're doing book publicity, you do so much of it leading up to the book release, and you can't spoil anything. And then nobody ever asks you to talk about the books after it's out. So I forget we can be spoilerific.
Books are out.
Yeah,
They're here.
yeah. So like, yeah, the power, the magic is a form of power. And so because of that, I think magic in some ways is always like thematically relevant in any story that's talking about power. And in this instance, I feel like we have a couple of, in the second book especially, we have a couple of perspectives on power, I think embodied by the truth seekers. Lumen is one of the hardest characters I've had to write, because you don't get inside her head, and she doesn't do a lot on screen, but she's essential to the functioning of the world. And she's also such like a super person that I was like, I had to think a lot about like, how does somebody like this even motivate themselves to get up in the morning? Like what do they want? Like you're good at everything apparently, like, what keeps you going? And so you have this kind of psychopathic view on power of like, I just want it because I want it. And there's actually not much more beyond that. And I think the problem with when you encounter people like that is that inevitably they're going to get it, right? Because they're willing to do anything for it. And so it's tough, because you want power to be in the hands of people who will treat it respectfully. But those people typically aren't so power thirsty that they're going to outcompete the people who want it just to want it. And so you end up in these, at least in this world, in these perpetuating cycles of the people who want it most get it, even though they don't necessarily have any real good reason to have it. They just want it. And so you kind of have Lumen, who embodies that. And then you have Izen, who's like she's her own situation where like she's big into education. She loves reading. She loves being educated. And that's its own form of power, right? Especially when it comes to the magic system, knowing more. but she kind of wants that education for its own sake. Even she doesn't necessarily have any like, she doesn't want to get, to learn more so she can benefit society. She just wants to learn more. And so she's just constantly curious and intrigued. And that's kind of its own danger, I think. Um, and then you have Hizo, who seems to, he has a good amount of power. There's not a ton of truth seekers. He's pretty elite, but the power he's gotten, it seems to be like a survival mechanism. I don't go a ton into his backstory, but he has enough power to allow him to keep doing what he's doing and paying his bills and living the life he has. I think on the one hand feels less terrifying than like what Lumen and Izan have, which is just a relentless lust for power for its own sake. At the same time, though, like it's sad because he knows better, right? He's doing destructive things, and he knows he's doing destructive things in a way that the other two don't really think that way about it, and yet he's doing it anyway. And so you kind of have three different, very poor moral examples that Ose has to deal with in a way that makes me sad for him. And it's kind of the opposite of what Tutu gets, which are kind of three upstanding moral examples who really protect him and guide him in the right path. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Can we talk about
Hizu
Ose for?
oh, sorry. I was gonna say
Go ahead.
like Hizu is a character who like Osi has the biggest like I don't really like him. I don't really know why, but
Yeah.
he's also the one who knows better. So he is the one who's like almost trying to be like, hey, like we have to do this for a reason, like hinting to him like you have to numb yourself, you have to do these things.
Yeah.
But Osi really idolizes the more like Machiavellian like
Right.
type of
Yeah.
Yeah.
people. Yeah.
Well, and it makes sense because Osi is just like he's got this immense pride and confidence in himself. And he is one of those people, like you mentioned, that is like, I'm going to be very powerful. I'm going to seek out these things myself. And it's interesting because there's cautions given to both Tutu and Osi, but the way that Osi is cautioned by the other characters is really different. And like early on, I believe it's his father that cautions him to fear that he may not do right. And I feel like throughout the book, Osi really doesn't question himself very often. And I was wondering if you think that there was a turning point for him in the book in terms of his ability to question himself, or if there wasn't one.
Yeah, I think it comes too late, unfortunately. You know, um, if I did it right, I think it comes too late for the reader too. That's the intent. Is I don't want. I think it's very easy to look down on OC, hopefully until the end, and you realize that we all kind of got duped. But
Yeah.
He's at that age. He's a teenager. They don't often think they're wrong. They're on the cusp of discovering the world, and they're energized by all this new information they're able to finally process and categorize. And so it's very easy to feel like, all right, I get it. I get it, Dad. I don't need you to tell me like, what's what. Um, and especially when he meets Obasa and gets this other worldview, then he's really convinced he's figured it out, right? Because now he's able to counter the knowledge of everyone he grew up with this new knowledge. He thinks, okay, I've got way more than anybody. How can I be wrong? But he still is. And that's kind of the unfortunate realities. And he's in a very complex society. And there's people who have been kind of playing this game way longer than he has. And he's coming late to this story. And so, yeah, only at the end. I think by the end, he's so completely committed to questioning whether or not he's right or wrong that there's that line that like he has no more conviction. Like he's convictionless. He can no longer trust that he's right about anything. It's kind of a sad endpoint, which is in a weird way, it's the desired endpoint. When earlier on, when he's so brash and so confident, you wish he'd be more questioning. And then he gets to the end, you're like, oh, I didn't want you to be more questioning like this. It's kind of sad.
Well, and it's such a like when you're reading book two, I honestly kind of thought it was going to be formulaic and follow the same pattern as book one. And then when there's just like this rug pulled out from under you, you're like, no, why?
Yeah.
So you're crushed right along with him.
I'm glad to hear that. That's the goal. You never know how well these things will land, but yeah, the books are in conversation with each other. You can read them standalone, but if you've read book one and I did it right, you definitely feel like you're ahead of book two in a way that you never actually are.
Yeah.
For sure.
You did that very effective. And you do it from the start because like I said, something that was surprising to me was your use of Tutu in book two. You kind of invert the fable of like what happened to him in book one. And I think it's so unique to place these books in conversation with each other, but having them 500 years apart where you get to see how fables get told and changed. And it makes me think a lot about how history, there's often the old adage like history is told by the winners. So
Yeah,
it's never told by those who had to go through it. So
yeah.
what was it like developing the truth of the Aleke after book one and like shifting Tutu's story and kind of like almost doing him dirty like that a little bit?
Did do him. I mean, that was the real excitement in writing this trilogy. That was really like I was like, if I do this right, I know when they open book two, they're going to be like, what the fuck is happening? Like, what is going on? And so I was really, really, really excited about writing a lot of scenes in book two that, yeah, invert the story of book one, especially because, Tutu's a nice kid and you do feel for him. And so to see, when you die, you don't get to control your story, and to see his legacy sometimes soiled, given what he went through, it's infuriating and it sucks and you feel helpless and you know when we think about history, I think of Martin Luther King a lot as a really good example. In his lifetime, most Americans, there's polls from around that time, most Americans did not like him. I know it's easy to think now he's an American hero, but it was upwards of 60% of Americans had a negative opinion of him.
Mhm.
And so at some point, from his assassination to maybe 40 years later, less even, he became an icon, he became an American hero. And it's like, well, what changed and what happened and how did that process happen? And it's a combination of a lot of things. I'm not a historian, so I don't want to speak authoritatively on this, but it's it's a lot of things that are required to take somebody from a villain to a hero in 40 years, right? And if you were in the same way that I think, like you said, when you hopped into book two, you were like jarred by how jarring it was. If you were to take somebody who died in 1968, when Martin Luther King was like considered a rabble rouser in his protests for being depicted as destructive to city streets, and you woke them up in 2023, and you said, "Remember MLK?" They're like, "That dude as a holiday? Like, what happened? Like how? I thought we all didn't like him." It's like, yeah, history's weird, and
Yeah.
you sanitize somebody's message, and you perhaps co-opt their movement in some ways, or you the people who remembered him fondly get more power. I mean, it's all these different things that kind of change what somebody's legacy will be. I mean, now we see, maybe not recent years, but last 5 years, we saw a lot of statues get torn down of like historical figures. Those, you don't get a statue for being a nobody. You got to do a lot and be pretty well regarded to get a statue. And less than 200 years later, people hate you so much they're tearing your statues down. You didn't do anything. It's not like you changed, came out the grave and started beating people up. You've been dead, and yet your history and your legacy has changed so much that you're now hated. So that's something I was super excited about playing with in the books.
Yeah, you definitely are able to like kind of mess with the idea of like who is a hero and what the hero's journey looks like from book one to book two. That was going to actually be my next question, but you answered it perfectly right there. But there's the sense of the characters like being desperate to learn more about their worlds. And I feel like there's this really interesting shift that occurs between the first and second books in the Forever Desert where Tutu like seeks help and discovers oppression that his people suffer from. And Osi's pride often just like blinds him and stops him from seeing the truth fully. Why did you want to kind of write this shift in that search for truth?
Yeah, I think the first book is very much more fairy tale-ish than the second. And I think in fairy tales, um, characters are a lot more redeeming than perhaps in real life, and they're a lot more understandable. I think the second book, Osi is less of a fairy tale. And I think in real life, most people don't see the truth most of the time,
Mhm.
like self-included. It's not indictment on others, like it's very difficult. It was very easy. Part of it's age too. It's very easy when you're 12 to learn something new and just change your whole worldview because you didn't really have much of a worldview. You were 12. It gets harder as you get older, a little older and a little more convicted, and you think you know better. And so somebody just gives you a fact. You don't revise your whole worldview. You maybe take it, maybe you just toss it. You're like, I don't buy that. And so I think most of us are more like OC than we are like Tutu. I think it's really easy to attach to Tutu and be like, oh, he's the best. That's how I am. But I feel like the state of the world would say otherwise. I think most of us, when we encounter new information, we kind of dismiss it if it doesn't make sense of what we know.
Mhm.
And some of that's required to be a convicted person. You know, if you're out there marching on the streets for something you believe in, nobody should be able to dissuade you with a sentence. You know, if you really believe it, you should hold on to it. Even if somebody comes with some facts a little contradictory, if you're out, you know, if you believe it's a good cause, keep doing it. But this is the cost of that. This is what that means, is that you are less open to other information. And you just got to hope that the thing you're convicted about is the right thing.
Yeah, you mentioned in your acknowledgments of the second book how OC is who you fear yourself to be.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, what a profound statement. Like I and it really just kind of ties all of that together in just like a really simple way where it's like, yeah, I fear that a lot of us are like that.
I definitely
Yeah.
resonated more with OC, where I was like, oh, I'm definitely
Mm-hmm.
like, I can
Yep.
feel myself in very stark contrast to like 2 2. I
Yeah.
was like, oh, he's so wonderful and I never want anything bad to happen to him. And in the second book, I was like, nope, this is definitely me. Like,
Yeah,
Right.
it kind of gets back to the thing that Hannah and I say jokingly often on the podcast where we're like, you know who I hate the most? Myself.
Yeah, I think I feel like the response to the second book is the people who don't see themselves in OC think it's a dumb book, and the people who see themselves in OC are like, oh man, this is good.
Mhm.
But yeah, I see a ton of myself in OC, and I don't. If you've ever been convicted in anything, you should, right? Like you
yeah.
really, especially when you're young, you really believe what you believe. And OC is not a bad person. In some ways, he might be the only good person in the whole in the whole book. You know, like he genuinely wants to do what's right for people. He wants to take care of people, and he wants to punish bad people. These are all great impulses.
Mhm.
But you know, we're humans, you know, and like
Mhm.
you, the only information he has access to is just whatever he's encountered in 17 years. And what if you're totally wrong? What if
Yeah.
your conception of good people and bad people is completely off? And so you're punishing really great people and you're celebrating really awful people. Well, none of
Mhm.
us really have any control over that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I think especially, I'm hesitant to go here sometimes because you know different audiences feel differently. But as Americans, like you know, we have a very complex relationship with oppression and with destruction. And if you've ever met anybody who grew up in Hussein's Iraq or grew up in Gaddafi's Syria or grew up in Gaddafi's Libya or Bashar al-Assad's Syria or any of the countries we've intervened in, um, it's really enlightening to hear their perspective and hear what they think. Even people who grew up under the Taliban, like I haven't always liked the American government or the administration in charge. I don't know if I would appreciate a foreign country destroying Los Angeles to punish that leader.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, how do
Yep.
you, even if you
Yeah.
hate Trump, you know, how do you
Mhm.
conceptualize that? How do you deal with that?
Mhm.
And so when it comes to issues of right and wrong, good and bad, I think as Americans, when we accept that we consume more than any other country in the world and that
Yeah.
other countries suffer environmental effects because we want to have constant air conditioning, because we want to have bigger cars, like
Well, and
how
because,
can we, it's difficult for me to convince myself that I'm not OC, right?
yeah.
Mhm.
If anyone is Tutu, it's probably not an American. They're almost certainly somebody
Yep.
in a different
Yeah.
situation.
Yeah. I would agree with that. And I think
Absolutely.
it's, it kind of shows through like your complexities with OC. And you mentioned this in your acknowledgments as well, in the truth of the Aleke, that like OC has more complex relationships with people than Tutu did. And he
Mm.
has these like complex personalities, and the fact that he is very like motivated also means that he's easily preyed upon by others because they see that in him. And so like what was it like building these different characters? I know you said you struggled with some characters more than
Mm.
others, to like have this like preying upon this person who is idealistic and using him for their own machinations.
Yeah, Lumen was the toughest for sure. Lumen then Ezen required the most revisions. I spent a lot of time rewriting them. Hizo, because he's more honest, it was easier to write. I mean, he kind of behaves in alignment with his values, which is like his values that this kid's kind of annoying and stupid, but I don't think he deserves a terrible fate. Um, Whereas Lumen from the jump is like, how can I, in what way does this kid serve my plans? And so then I had to figure out, well, what are her plans? How has she been acting on them historically? What stage is she at now? And what role can he play? And how does she see? You know, there's a lot I had to figure out with her. Izen's just a weirdo, so like it was a little easier than that. If I just picked the weirdest behavior and give it to her, it kind of worked. Um, and then OC was tough because he's not he's kind of stupid. He's stupid, but he's not like stupid because his brain's bad. He's stupid because he's myopic. He's narrow-minded, you know. And so, as we saw with when he saw the version of Tutu's story Obasa showed him, he's able to revise his opinion and grow. So it was very tough to like figure out when would OC actually learn from something versus when would he resist it. And trying to make that feel organic was pretty hard, to be honest. There's a lot of revising.
I mean, like this book, it's so much more complex than this. So I don't mean to insult it by saying this, but it is kind of like a stupid kid on social media these days where they're like, I just want to become famous. And then they like get something on their algorithm and they're like, well, now I believe this. Now I believe this. So yeah.
Yeah, poor guy, you know. Yeah.
Well, we talked about how OC's ending is really more gut-wrenching than Tutu's, but something I noticed is that they both end with tears or the holding back of tears. Was this intentional, and like what was the significance of showing the emotions and the tears of both of these characters at their ends?
Yeah, each book will kind of, I think crying's a beautiful, fascinating thing. It's such a, especially tears, like not all other animals cry with tears and produce tears. Like it's a very uniquely human way to express that when you are sad, water leaks out of your eyes, you know? And so, especially in the context of the first book, what water means and its importance, crying and tears mean a lot to Tutu. There's a lot of lessons he's been taught about it. And so when I was writing the second book, and I knew in some ways Tutu and OC were going to be mirrors to each other, opposites, like I thought about how Tutu felt about crying and how he had to restrain it. And I was like, yeah, OC's probably not that guy. He's so emotional. You know, he's probably always crying. He's always angry. He's always happy. You know, whatever he's feeling, he's displaying it pretty hard. And so it kind of became a waypoint. Tears became like a waypoint for me for his character of like, where is he at in his development based on how he thinks about crying and how he treats it. And so, you know, when he's very convicted and he's always sure he's right, it's very easy to cry because this thing is so unfair and I know it's unfair and it's so unjust and I'm so distraught, or this thing is, you know, dangerous or whatever. And by the end, like what would he even cry about? He doesn't know anything anymore. He doesn't know what's wrong. He doesn't know what's right. You know, he doesn't even know where to be sad. There's a line in the first book. Fume asks Tutu, like, what have they taken from you? And I think like that's something OC kind of lost in the second book. He kind of did lose his tears. And for better and for worse, the kid was crying a lot. He needs to cut it out. But at the same time, like it was kind of who he was. You know, he's an emotional guy and he's lost a bit of that.
He did cry a lot. I loved it when there was the moment of one of the guards calling him out on it. And he's like, this guy cries all the time. And I'm like, wow, he's like a hero in this city. And even the guards are like, wow, you need to calm down a little.
You're the chosen one. Stop it.
Right. Yeah.
Well, something we haven't talked about the books is the covers of these. These are some of the most beautiful covers.
Beautiful.
I literally showed my sister-in-law, like, I was like, look at it. It's so mind tripping. So can you like talk a little bit about the creation of these covers and like what went into them?
Shout out to Tor.com as a publisher. They, you know, if there's any aspiring writers listening, there's a lot of horror stories about how like you don't get to choose your title or your covers. They're not wrong. That's often the case in book publishing. Tor.com has been incredible, especially my editors, Carl and Matt. Like they gave me so much say. I mean, they gave me so much say, and they were so communicative about the vision. We were all on the same page. The first book, I said like I want Attack on Titan in North Africa vibes, and I kind of set the poster of Attack on Titan season 1, and I knew I wanted it to be like a little boy against a much bigger power, you know. We sent it off to the artist, Alyssa Winans, and Christine Foltzer is the kind of cover designer. And they worked on it and they sent back the first draft and they nailed it. I mean, that was basically the first draft, what you see there. They just understood fully what we're trying to communicate. They added that kind of like reversible globing effect. I didn't have that in mind. They added it and I was like, this is perfect. This, you know, shows even better what we're getting at. This kind of power dichotomy, this truth, you know, fact versus fiction, truth versus falsehood. And so for the second book, we kind of had a template to go off of. We knew what story we were telling. And I just gave them the characters and I gave them the world. And I remember I got it back before I was done on final edits on the second book. So I was still kind of workshopping the second book. And I got the cover back. I was like, oh no, this is better than the book. Like, this looks so much better than what I've written. I got to step it up because it was so evocative of the world that I'd imagined. And she hadn't read the book yet. So I don't know how. The first one,
Oh,
she read the book first. Second one, she hadn't. I was like, this is incredible. She pulled this off. Um, yeah, and so the third book, the cover's out now, and it's very much the same thing. I mean, Alyssa Winans has won all the awards for a reason. She's a genius. Christine Folzer is a genius, and they just always nail it. It's amazing.
well, in the third book, the cover for it almost looks a little bit like eerie, almost like dilapidated feel to
Mm,
it compared to the first and second books, where it's very much here where it's like this is a kingdom that we're
yeah,
seeing. And so I'm excited to see how that kind of connects into the third book too, because it's a little bit eerie looking.
yeah, yeah. The first two books. I mean, the first one is very much a kind of classic fable style boy in the desert. The second one, we see water, which
Mhm.
implies there's
Hmm.
some differences. The third book, as I said, dives much more into the magic system, and so I mean, you've read the first and second books. So you could probably imagine if I'm really diving into the magic system, there's going to be some sad things happening.
Oh yeah.
So
No.
the cover does a good job of reflecting kind of a mood shift.
Yeah, for sure. It makes me nervous and I can't wait.
Can you tell us a little bit more, like any more plot to what's going to happen in the third installment of the series, or is that like under wraps right now?
I never know what I'm about to say, to be honest. I wish. Part of it's I'm still working, I'm still finalizing, still tightening bolts. So in theory, who knows? I'll wake up and rewrite the whole thing. But in practice, it's um, yeah, it takes place in a place called the City of a Thousand Stories, and it is about a kind of a scholar who is seeking out the origins of this city. I'm trying not to say things that I think are spoilers. No, I don't think that's a spoiler. Yeah, he's inspired by the historical records he's found about a guy named Osi,
Mhm.
and he's kind of going to be digging into um, finding Osi's tomb and what may lie there about the kind of the history of where the city came from.
Amazing.
I cannot wait. I'm just so excited. But after really loving the Forever Desert books, I'm really curious about, I think it's called the Sisters of the Mud series. Is that what it's
Mhm.
called? Can you tell us more about those books? And I saw that you have a new book in that series coming out in March.
Yeah. So those books they're YA. So it's YA fantasy. The first book, they take place on an island. It's called the Isle. And it's there's no adults on this island. It's all children. And this book is about a um, group of girls who compete in this kind of like style of magical wrestling. It's this martial arts sport. Um, and they compete for the survival of their tribe. So if they win, they get new recruits and the tribe grows. If they lose consecutively for a long time, their numbers thin out and the tribe disappears. And it's about this tribe that's on the cusp of disappearing. There's only 5 of them left. If they don't win this season, the other 2 are going to age out and they're done. And so it's about this older girl who has to. She's kind of retired. She's ready to age out, but their top competitor gets hurt, and she has to like step back in and fight for the survival of her tribe. Um, yeah, so that's kind of what the series is about. I love that book a lot.
Well, and the
It's
covers of
very
those books
fun.
are really cool too.
They do
I
a beautiful
you
job.
get really good covers.
I know. I'm really lucky, and it's fun because Daughters of Oduma and Lies of the Ajungo have like the same color palette. They came out around the
Hmm.
same time, so I don't know why that made me so happy, but it felt good. Yeah,
Yeah, I
and
was really impressed by those covers. I can't wait to check out these series too.
it's great. It's more West African culture influenced. There's more fantasy in a way, more about the gods, more about the magic. It has its own magic system and everything. Um, it has like a nice little pidgin dialect that the characters speak in. So yeah, hopefully you'll like start to pick up some of their isms and start talking like them. It's a lot of fun. Yeah, it's not it's not quite as dark as The Last Legion. That's why I try to be nice, but
Keep a little lighter.
I won't.
Yeah.
I won't be like just sitting there after reading it, like staring off into the abyss.
No, no. Yeah, it's a novel too. So there's a lot more ups and downs and fun side things and hilarious moments. Yeah. Overall, much more wholesome.
Well, good.
Well,
I
we've
can't
heard
wait.
quite a bit about these projects, but do you have any other projects in the works that our listeners should be on the lookout for?
Nothing for a while. I need a break. I've been writing a lot. I have things in the long works, like the next couple of years, but nothing like in the immediate. Just
It's a
look
lot
out
to
for
have
book
all of this
3.
come out in such
Yeah,
a
you
short
have-
amount of time.
I felt bad asking the
Yeah.
question because I was like, well, he has like a couple of things coming out, so it feels
Yeah.
like he's probably busy. So
No, yeah. I have Daughters of Oduma book 2 comes out next year.
Okay.
Lazuli Jingo book 3, The Forever Does book 3 comes out next year. And then I'm working on some stuff for the distant future. So
Well, we will be watching for that for sure. But in the meantime, what have you been reading, watching, and or enjoying?
Oh yeah, good question. I I'm a big House of the Dragon fan, so I was watching that. That just concluded this season. But as I said with anime, I started watching Jujutsu Kaisen.
I love that.
Kind of started it and put it on hold. You said what?
I love Jujutsu Kaisen so much.
It's great. And like I didn't fully buy in at first. I was kind of like, and then I'm like deep into season 2 now, and I'm like, oh, I fully get it. Season 2 is wild.
I love it so much.
Yeah, I'm enjoying it quite a bit. And I'm reading Chain Gang All Stars. I don't have it with me. It's somewhere on my couch.
That looks so good.
By Nana Kwame. Yeah, I'm not done yet. So I can't, it's the kind of book that I know when I'm done with it, I'll have a very different perspective on it, but it's very interesting so far, and I like where it's going.
Okay,
yeah,
good to know. Well,
can I ask, is Gojo your favorite character in Jujutsu Kaisen?
One of the dopest characters.
Oh my gosh, amazing.
Yeah,
amazing.
Yeah,
I'm like, do I get fan art of this character because I love him so much?
Yeah.
Laura and I do a side series called TV Tuesdays. You're always welcome on if you ever want to talk about.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
That'd be fun. Yeah,
we will put out that invite now. So, and can you tell our listeners where they can find you or your books?
Yeah, you can find me on social media, Instagram, mostly Instagram. I'm not on Twitter these days as much. My website, MosesOseUtomi.com. Find me there, and my Instagram is just Google Moses Ose Utomi and click my Instagram. It's probably the easiest way. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, we want to thank you so much for coming on and discussing these books with us. They are life-changing.
Really
so if you've listened to this and listened to some spoilers, what were you doing? They're so easy to read. Go get them and read them. So.
Yes, pick them up at your library, buy them at your local indie bookstore. You need these books, people.
Yeah. But you are always welcome to come back on and discuss the third book when it comes out. We cannot wait. But thank you so much again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was a blast.
These are amazing books. Love them so much.
And thank you, listeners, for dialing in for another week. We will see you next week for regularly scheduled content. Bye.
Bye.